welcome to video number 2 of reviewing A Book of Silence by Sarah Maitland. So another aspect of silence that she explores she looks very much at romanticism and how for romantics sought silence as a way of developing their self away from the corrupting influences of society. Romanticism was quite a different way of exploring silence to, say, the desert hermits, because the desert hermits were all about trying to completely and utterly destroy their ego in order to open themselves up to the kind of divine, as it were. Whereas the romantics were all about strengthening their ego or self away from the corrupting influences of society. So these are two very different ways of getting in touch with silence for different purposes. I am interested in romanticism because I am quite a romantic person myself, in some respects. This is all about Wordsworth and Shelley and people like that, Rousseau. And romanticism very much came aboard in sort of like 18th century, but it was a kind of reaction to the kind of like extreme intellectualism of the Enlightenment. It's all about shoring up the individual's boundaries against social construction. The idea in the 19th century that everyone had the right to individual expression, everyone's entitled to shake off the shackles of social obligation and aspire to self-actualisation. However, there's a bit of a contradiction here, because the overall experience of the oppressed was that they had been silenced rather than freely choosing silence. Silence is very different if it's chosen, if it's freely chosen, to if, say, it's imposed. The political freedom movement saw the right to speak and to be heard as crucial, and this overrode the belief that the solution lay in escape from the restraints of society and into solitude. So, as I say, a bit of a contradiction there. On the one hand, there's a belief that social intercourse corrodes freedom. On the other hand, the belief that naming oneself or one's oppression in solidarity with others is a pre-necessity of freedom. And I thought that was quite interesting, and we can see a lot of that in the autism community today. By being part of the community is kind of contradictory. On the one hand, it can maybe sometimes in a sense, corrode someone's freedom if they feel that they have to toe the line, as it were. We can see a lot of that in the neurodiversity movement, which can be quite divisive, but on the other hand, it can enable people to kind of, come out of the closet and to be heard. So it contains both positive and negative aspects. So part of romanticism then is romanticism was very much about introspection and a fascination with the self. If it wasn't for the romantics, we wouldn't have autobiographies today. It was all about also the idea, the sort of mourning of lost innocence, the idea that children are born free and that social life corrupted them, and also very much about the beauties of nature, as we see in Wordsworth. Because the prelude, which celebrates rural childhood escaping from the city to gain freedom, and how solitude in nature influences creativity by strengthening the individual against the mean and vulgar works of man. The child is father to the man. Children are uncontaminated by society, returning to the scenes of childhood, alone in silence, which allowed him to access his innocence. And also, Maitland argues that silent walking can also improve memory, like it improved her memory when she went off to be silent. It improved her memory and enabled her to construct a more coherent narrative of her own life, and a narrative of herself as an individual unmediated by other people's interpretation. Without interruptions or comments, you can retrieve memories. And the idea that the inner self is more true than the socially constructed persona. She also argues that silence is more primitive. It's a kind of emotionally chaotic part of the brain. We can get in touch with this more emotionally chaotic part of the brain that exists prior to language. A sort of of a different level of consciousness that's out with language. It's more subcortical, it's represented in older pre-linguistic parts of the brain. And interestingly, silence practitioners often comment on the difficulty of recalling, remembering, focusing on, reporting or articulating what it is that they felt or experienced. It's out with language, it's not linear, it's not ordered, they can't speak about it. There's a sort of ineffability of their experiences with silence. And there's a psycholinguist called Julia Christopher, a French psycholinguist, who argues that language actually articulates the self into being through the symbolic. And the symbolic is only accessible through cutting a deal, whereby the individual gives up freedoms in exchange for what she calls cephalic law. There is, though, a pre-phallic pool of articulation, which is still capable of emotional expression, what she calls the semiotic. And this is pre-conscious, but silence maybe offers people who want it a return journey into the semiotic, a seedbed of the self prior to language, there's a more ancient, kind of like primitive part of the self. By sort of destabilising the independent self gained through language, losing the ego, rather than establishing it in logical language, getting in touch more, with that kind of very primitive kind of animal nature, where the boundaries between self and other are less kind of clearly defined. Very deep stuff. Silence can also lead to disinhibition as well. Kind of as you give up the mask, you become more free. And also, interestingly, there is actually another book I'd like to read called The World of Silence by Max Pickard, which I might check out as well, just noticed I think on my reading list. And also looking at as well, she looks as well at, how creation narratives, Christianity and Islam and Judaism are very much defined by the word and language, whereas other creation myths emphasise more silence and gradual kind of coming into being. There's even an Egyptian myth whereby Atum, the sun god, actually masturbated through masturbation is what led to creation, which is quite interesting. And also, finally, there's a term which I find quite interesting called jouissance, playfulness and joy. It's often experienced by children. It's a profound joy, and Wordsworth mourned its passing in his intimations of immortality from recollections of early childhood. It's a kind of expansion, an infinite opening out of delight, kind of beyond delight, but without resolution. So it's an absolute free kind of expression of joy, spontaneous, without any kind of like order or coherence to it, that children express this profound joy, just completely and utterly uninhibited, but we can lose as we grow older, and it's what Wordsworth mourned, which is quite sad. But yeah, so do let me know what you think about this in the comments box below. So I hope you enjoyed watching, so thank you.